You think you know the Viking story. Dragon ships cutting through morning mist, battle axes splitting shields, warriors earning their place in Valhalla. But nobody talks about what happened next. When the war cries faded and the smoke cleared, when the last sword fell silent. What happened to the women left behind? The wives of the defeated, the daughters of the conquered, the mothers who watched their world burn. Where did they go when the Vikings claimed victory? The answer sits in graves across Ireland, England, and Scotland. In slave markets from Dublin to Baghdad, in DNA that still flows through modern bloodlines. This is their story, the one written in bone and silver, in shackles and wedding rings. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Uppsala University Viking Phenomenon Project, published in 2024 at Rau, and archaeological reports from the Annals of Ulster dating to 821 CE. These are deep archival sources that reveal the systematic nature of Viking captive taking. Now back to the information. 821, Howth, on Ireland's coast. The Annals of Ulster record it with brutal clarity. Vikings plundered the settlement and carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not treasure, not cattle. Women? This wasn't random violence. This was strategy. Vikings understood that controlling women meant controlling the future of conquered lands. The wives of defeated Anglo-Saxon thanes, the daughters of Gaelic chieftains, the noble women of Pictish strongholds, they became the invisible cargo that built Viking power. Dublin's slave market. Circa 900. The largest human trafficking hub in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence from Wood Quay shows iron shackles sized specifically for women. Ben Raffield from Uppsala University estimates that women comprised 60% of Dublin's slave trade. These weren't just captured peasants. These were the wives and daughters of warriors who died defending their homes. A noblewoman from Leinster could fetch 20 silver pieces, enough to outfit 3 Viking warriors for a raid. The market operated with industrial efficiency. Ships arrived weekly from raids across Britain, their holds packed with captives who had days earlier been free wives managing great households. The system worked like this. Viking raiders struck hard and fast, targeting settlements during harvest season when men were scattered in fields. They killed the fighting men, burned the halls, then sorted the survivors. Old women and children too young to work were often killed on the spot. But wives of warriors, daughters of thanes, women who knew weaving, brewing, and managing estates, these were worth more alive than dead. They were shackled at the ankles with iron chains, loaded onto ships like cargo, and transported to markets in Dublin, Hedeby, or Birka. What made noble wives especially valuable wasn't just their skills, it was their bloodlines. Marriage to a conquered enemy's wife legitimized Viking rule. When Ivar the Boneless conquered East Anglia in 869, where he didn't just claim the throne, he claimed King Edmund's widow. When the Great Army carved up Northumbria in 876, Danish jarls married Anglo-Saxon noblewomen to cement their control over English lands. Genetic studies published in 2020 by Nature magazine confirm this pattern. Mitochondrial DNA from Viking-age graves shows systematic intermarriage between Scandinavian men and British women across conquered territories. The archaeology tells the full story. Westness Cemetery in Orkney holds 9 furnished graves from the 9th century. 7 contain oval brooches, distinctly Scandinavian jewelry typically buried with women, but isotope analysis of the teeth reveals these women grew up in Scotland and Ireland, not Norway. They were local noblewomen who married into Viking families after conquest. Their grave goods show they retained high status, but their origins reveal they were war prizes, wives of defeated chieftains who became wives of Viking jarls. Birka, Sweden, trading hub on Lake Mellerin. Chambergrave BJ 581 contained the remains of a high-ranking warrior surrounded by weapons, gaming pieces, and sacrificed horses. DNA analysis in 2017 proved the warrior was female, but isotope analysis suggests she grew up outside Scandinavia. Possibly in the British Isles, this wasn't a Scandinavian shield maiden. This was likely a British noblewoman who rose to power in Viking society after being captured as a wife of war. The slave routes stretched from Ireland to Iraq. Captive women from Viking raids in Britain were transported via the Volga trade route to slave markets in Baghdad, Samarkand, and Constantinople. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling the Volga in 922, described seeing large throngs of captured Christians being hauled away through Swedish trading posts. Archbishop Rimbert of Bremen witnessed a Christian nun singing psalms in the slave market at Hedeby, a woman taken from a monastery raid who identified herself to buyers through her faith. Not all captured wives became slaves. Many became secondary wives in polygamous Viking households. The Icelandic sagas describe jarls maintaining both legitimate Scandinavian wives and captured foreign women as concubines. Archaeological evidence from farmsteads in Iceland shows graves of women buried with Gaelic jewelry alongside Scandinavian grave goods, suggesting they retained aspects of their original culture while integrating into Norse society. Their children inherited both bloodlines, creating the mixed populations that DNA studies reveal across the North Atlantic. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Christian women captured in raids found themselves in pagan households, forced to participate in religious rituals they had been taught to fear. The conversion worked both ways. Many Viking men who married Christian captives eventually converted themselves, accelerating the Christianization of Scandinavia. Rune stones from 11th century Sweden commemorate Christian women married to pagan Vikings. Their names carved alongside prayers in Latin. Cumwitten Cemetery in Cumbria holds the remains of a mixed community from the 9th century. Grave analysis shows both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon burial practices side by side. Women buried with oval brooches lie next to others buried with Anglo-Saxon jewelry. Strontium isotope analysis reveals multiple generations of intermarriage between Viking settlers and local women. This wasn't conquest, it was assimilation, built on the marriages of captured wives. The economic impact was staggering. A single raid on an Irish monastery in 845 netted 300 captives, mostly women and children. At 20 silver pieces each, that represents 6,000 pieces of silver, enough to fund a fleet of 30 longships. The wealth from selling defeated warriors. Multiple wives financed the expansion that carried Vikings to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually America. The slave trade wasn't a side effect of Viking expansion. It was the engine that powered it. Some fought back. The fragmentary annals of Ireland describe Ingen Ruaid, the Red Girl, a captured noblewoman who escaped slavery to lead her own Viking fleet in the 9th century. Her story shows that some wives of defeated warriors didn't just survive conquest, they mastered it, turning Viking tactics against their captors. Runestones from Gotland commemorate women who died in the East, possibly captives who fought their way to freedom in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. Ibn Fadlan witnessed the ultimate fate awaiting some captive wives. During the funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga, a slave girl volunteered to accompany her dead master. The ceremony involved ritual sexual encounters with multiple men before she was strangled and stabbed by an angel of death. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian ship burials confirms this practice. At Oseberg, 2 women were buried with magnificent grave goods, but one shows signs of having been sacrificed. The secondary burial was likely a captured noblewoman forced to serve her captor in death as she had in life. The ritual details reveal the systematic dehumanization involved. Ibn Fadlan describes the slave girl being intoxicated with alcohol and possibly hallucinogenic drugs before the ceremony. She was dressed in fine clothes and jewelry, not as honor, but as preparation for sacrifice. The sexual encounters weren't consensual acts, but rape disguised as ritual, designed to transfer life force taunt to the dead chieftain. Her screams were drowned out by warriors beating shields, a coordinated effort to mask the violence. Archaeological analysis of ship burial sites across Scandinavia reveals this practice was widespread, not exceptional. At Gokstad, Waning, chemical analysis of soil beneath the ship shows traces of human blood inconsistent with the main burial. At Thun, skeletal remains include a female whose bone chemistry suggests foreign origin and whose position in the grave indicates secondary status. These weren't willing companions choosing to follow beloved husbands. They were property sacrificed to maintain their owner's status in the afterlife. The selection process for funeral sacrifices followed brutal logic. Captive wives who had born children were usually spared because their offspring represented valuable inheritance links. Childless women, especially those showing signs of resistance or depression, were considered expendable. Some volunteered for death as escape from unbearable lives. But Islamic sources suggest many were chosen regardless of their wishes. Their volunteering was coerced through threats against other captives. Bone analysis from mass grave sites associated with ship burials reveals the scale of these sacrifices. At Burka, secondary graves contain remains of at least a dozen women who died simultaneously, showing cut marks consistent with ritual killing. Isotope analysis confirms many were foreign-born, likely captives from different raids gathered for a single chieftain's funeral. Their deaths weren't random violence. They were calculated demonstrations of wealth and power, measured in the lives of conquered women. The genetic legacy persists today. Modern populations in Iceland, Orkney, and the Hebrides carry mitochondrial DNA lineages that trace back to Iron Age Britain and Ireland, not Scandinavia. These maternal bloodlines tell the story of thousands of women who survived conquest, adapted to new lives, and passed their heritage to children who would grow up as Vikings themselves. Their descendants ruled kingdoms from Dublin to Kiev, carrying the blood of defeated warriors through generations of conquerors. Legal documents from medieval Iceland show how these women navigated their new reality. The Gragas law code describes the rights of foreign wives, women married after being captured in raids. They could own property, demand compensation for abuse, and even initiate divorce proceedings. Some achieved remarkable power. Aud the Deep-Minded, one of Iceland's first settlers, was herself the widow of a Viking king and mother to another. Her story shows how captured wives could transform from victims to matriarchs. Archaeological evidence from York reveals the urban transformation that followed conquest. The Viking city of Jorvik shows clear signs of female-controlled textile production, with workshops run by women producing the high-quality fabrics that clothed Viking armies. Isotope analysis of these workers reveals many came from outside Scandinavia, likely captured wives and daughters who brought their skills to York's booming economy. Their labor dressed the same men who had enslaved them. Dublin's transformation tells the larger story. The settlement began as a Viking stronghold in 841, built around the slave trade that processed captives from raids across Ireland and Britain. By 1000, it had become a cosmopolitan city where Gaelic, Norse, and Anglo-Saxon cultures blended. Archaeological layers from Christchurch Cathedral show this evolution, from simple long fort to complex urban center built on the wealth generated by selling the wives and daughters of Ireland's warrior class. The Annals of Ulster record that in 980 as King Mael Secnaill stormed Viking Dublin and freed all the Irish slaves held in captivity. This mass liberation reveals the scale of enslavement. Thousands of Irish women and children held in the city's slave quarters, but genetic evidence suggests many chose to stay. Mitochondrial DNA from medieval Dublin shows continuing Irish maternal lineages alongside Scandinavian paternal ones, evidence of the complex relationships that developed between captors and captives. The liberation itself was selective and politically motivated. King Mael Secnaill freed only slaves of Irish origin, leaving captured Anglo-Saxons, Scots, and Welsh in bondage. This wasn't humanitarian intervention, but ethnic reclamation, recovering lost Irish population while denying competitors the same benefit. Archaeological evidence suggests many freed slaves remained in Dublin as paid workers, having developed skills and relationships that made return to their original homes impractical. Post-liberation Dublin shows fascinating demographic shifts. Cemetery analysis reveals that many former slaves married their former captors or their children, creating legally recognized unions that legitimized previous coercive relationships. These marriages often included significant bride prices paid retroactively, compensation for years of unpaid labor disguised as romantic gestures. The psychological complexity of these relationships defies simple categorization as either liberation or continued exploitation. Some liberated slaves refused freedom, choosing to remain with Viking families who had treated them well. Archaeological evidence from household compounds shows former slaves maintaining separate quarters, but continuing to perform specialized tasks like textile production or brewing. They received wages and could leave at will, but chose to stay in situations that provided security and purpose. These arrangements blur traditional distinctions between slavery and employment. The economic disruption from mass liberation forced Dublin's transformation from slave port to legitimate trading center. Without captive labor, Viking merchants had to develop new revenue streams. Archaeological evidence shows rapid expansion of craft production, metalworking, and long-distance trade in goods rather than people. The city's prosperity continued, but built on voluntary labor rather than human trafficking. Religious conversion accelerated after liberation. Many former slaves had maintained Christian faith in secret during captivity. Their public return to Christianity, combined with intermarriage with Vikings, created pressure for mass conversion. Archaeological evidence from Dublin's churches shows rapid construction of Christian facilities funded by converted Viking merchants seeking to legitimize their new social status. The slave trade's end came gradually. As Viking kingdoms converted to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, enslaving fellow Christians became problematic. The church actively ransomed captives. One account from 870 describes a monk selling his horse to free a nun from the slave market at Hedeby. Economic factors mattered too. The rise of feudalism made bound laborers more valuable than chattel slaves. The last recorded slave ship from Dublin sailed in 1170, but the genetic record shows the deeper truth. Studies of modern European populations reveal that Viking expansion wasn't primarily about Scandinavian settlement, it was about Scandinavian men taking foreign wives. From the Shetlands to Sicily, from Ireland to Ukraine. The pattern repeats, Scandinavian Y chromosome markers paired with local mitochondrial DNA. The wives of defeated warriors didn't just survive conquest, they became the mothers of medieval Europe's ruling class. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the journal Slavery and Abolition, published in 2019 by Taylor and Francis, documenting iron shackles found at Dublin Arms, Hedabai, and Burka. Now back to the information. The ultimate irony lies buried in the modern landscape. A 2022 soil analysis of an empty Viking grave in Denmark revealed traces of horse feces and human phosphorus, evidence of ritual burial practices invisible to earlier archaeologists. The grave had been robbed centuries ago, its contents scattered. But chemical signatures revealed what happened to one captured wife. She was buried with full honors alongside her captor, her own cultural identity erased so completely that only molecular traces remained. This is the unspoken truth about Viking conquest. It wasn't just about taking land or treasure, it was about taking bloodlines, taking futures, taking the very identity of defeated peoples, and weaving it into a new narrative of power. The wives of Anglo-Saxon thanes became mothers of Danish earls. The daughters of Gaelic chieftains bore children who would raid the same coasts their grandfathers had defended. The women who survived didn't just endure conquest, they became conquest, carrying the genetics of resistance into the heart of the Viking world. The last excavation at Wood Quay in Dublin, completed in 2018, uncovered a mass grave containing 37 individuals, mostly women and children, buried with signs of violence around 950. Their teeth contained isotope signatures from across Britain and Ireland, captives from multiple raids who died in Dublin's slave quarters, but buried alongside them were silver arm rings and amber beads, evidence that even in death, these women retained wealth and status their captors had granted them. The mass grave reveals the brutal economics underlying the slave trade's final phase. Carbon dating shows these deaths occurred during a plague outbreak that swept through Dublin's overcrowded slave quarters. Rather than lose valuable merchandise to disease, Viking merchants killed healthy captives to prevent further contamination. The presence of valuable grave goods suggests these weren't disposal killings, but ritualized sacrifices designed to transfer the women's commercial value to the afterlife. Bone pathology analysis reveals the conditions these women endured before death. Healed fractures suggest repeated physical abuse. Dental wear patterns indicate diets high in gritty foods, evidence of inadequate nutrition despite their value as trade goods. Joint deterioration shows prolonged heavy labor despite their status as high-value captives. Their bodies tell stories of systematic exploitation disguised as commercial investment. The burial arrangement follows specific patterns found in other Viking slave trading centers. Bodies are positioned in layers with the highest status captives, those with the most valuable grave goods, placed at the bottom. Lower status slaves were buried above them, creating a hierarchy that persisted into death. This wasn't random disposal, but organized cemetery management that reflected commercial valuations of human life. Trace element analysis of the grave soil reveals evidence of ritual purification ceremonies conducted before burial. Mercury deposits suggest cinnabar burning, a practice associated with spiritual cleansing in both Celtic and Norse traditions. This indicates the Viking merchants recognized some spiritual contamination from their treatment of these women and attempted religious remediation through elaborate funeral rites. The most disturbing discovery came from chemical analysis of the silver grave goods. The arm rings contain trace amounts of lead consistent with melted down Christian religious artifacts, crosses, chalices, and religious medallions stolen during monastery raids. The amber beads show tool marks from hasty removal of Christian symbols before burial. The Vikings buried these women with wealth created by destroying their spiritual heritage. Contemporary accounts suggest this mass burial coincided with the arrival of Christian missionaries in Dublin. The timing wasn't coincidental. Viking merchants may have killed their remaining stock to avoid church intervention and ransom demands. Archaeological evidence from other trading centers shows similar mass burials occurring during the transition to Christian rule, suggesting systematic elimination of evidence rather than gradual liberation. Modern DNA studies reveal the scope of this transformation. Roughly 30% of Icelandic mitochondrial DNA traces to Ireland and Scotland, not Scandinavia. These weren't immigrants, they were captives. The wives and daughters of defeated warriors whose bloodlines now flow through every major family in Iceland. Their descendants became the lawmakers and saga writers who shaped medieval literature, the very voices that would tell Viking history to the world. The wives didn't just survive conquest, they conquered the conquerors, through marriage, through children, through the simple persistence of existing, while their captors learned that ruling required more than sword work. The iron shackles found at Burka, Hedabai, and Dublin tell one story. The DNA flowing through modern Scotland, Ireland, and England tells another. In the end, the wives of defeated warriors didn't just endure the Viking Age, they became it. In 2024, archaeologists excavating a ship burial at Salma, Estonia, found something unexpected alongside the weapons in silver. A woman's amber necklace, its style distinctly Slavic. She wasn't buried in the ship. Her jewelry was carried by Vikings as remembrance or trophy, 8 miles away. They found her grave, a shallow pit containing the remains of a woman in her 30s, surrounded by cooking implements and weaving tools. Isotope analysis revealed she grew up in Latvia. Carbon dating showed she died within months of the ship burial. The necklace in the Viking grave was hers. She was the wife they couldn't take with them.